Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. Read by Kate Winslet. The family of Dashwood had been long settled in Sussex. Their estate was large, and their residence was at Norland Park. The late owner of this estate was a single man, who lived to a very advanced age, and who for many years of his life had a constant companion and housekeeper in his sister. But her death produced a great alteration in his home, for to supply her loss, he invited and received into his house the family of his nephew, Mr. Henry Dashwood, the legal inheritor of the Norland estate, and the person to whom he intended to bequeath it. By a former marriage, Mr. Henry Dashwood had one son, by his present lady 3 daughters. The son, a steady, respectable young man, was amply provided for by the fortune of his mother. By his own marriage, likewise, which happened soon afterwards, he added to his wealth. To him, therefore, the succession to the Norland estate was not so really important as to his sisters, for their fortune, independent of what might arise to them from their father's inheriting that property, could be but small. Their mother had nothing, and their father only £7,000 in his own disposal. The old gentleman died. His will was read, and like almost every other will, gave as much disappointment as pleasure. He was neither so unjust nor so ungrateful as to leave his estate from his nephew, but he left it to him on such terms as destroyed half the value of the bequest. Mr. Dashwood had wished for it more for the sake of his wife and daughters than for himself or his son, but to his son and his son's son, a child of 4 years old, it was secured in such a way as to leave to himself no power of providing for those who were more dear to him. The whole was tied up for the benefit of this child. He meant not to be unkind, however, and, as a mark of his affection for the 3 girls, he left them £1,000 apiece. Mr. Dashwood's disappointment was, at first, severe, but his temper was sanguine, and he might reasonably hope to live many years. But the fortune, which had been so tardy in coming, was his only 1/12 month. He survived his uncle no longer, and £10,000, including the late legacies, was all that remained for his widow and daughters. His son was sent for, and Mr. Dashwood recommended the interest of his mother-in-law and sisters. Mr. John Dashwood had not the strong feelings of the rest of the family, but he promised to do everything in his power to make them comfortable. He was not an ill-disposed young man, and less to be rather selfish is to be ill-disposed. Had he married a more amiable woman, he might have been made still more respectable than he was. But Mrs. John Dashwood was a strong caricature of himself, more narrow-minded and selfish. No sooner was his father's funeral over than Mrs. John Dashwood, without sending any notice of her intention to her mother-in-law, arrived with her child. Mrs. John Dashwood had never been a favourite with any of her husband's family, but she had had no opportunity, till the present, of shewing them with how little attention to the comfort of other people she could act when occasion required it. So acutely did Mrs. Dashwood feel this ungracious behaviour, she would have quitted the house for ever, had not the entreaty of her eldest girl induced her first to reflect on the propriety of going. Elinor, this eldest daughter whose advice was so effectual, possessed a strength of understanding and coolness of judgment which qualified her, though only 19, to be the counsellor of her mother. She had an excellent heart. Her disposition was affectionate, and her feelings were strong, but she knew how to govern them. It was a knowledge which her mother had yet to learn, and which one of her sisters had resolved never to be taught. Marianne's abilities were, in many respects, quite equal to Elinor's. She was sensible and clever, but eager in everything. Her sorrows, her joys could have no moderation. She was generous, amiable, interesting. She was everything but prudent.